Welcome to today's webcast, the CFO Playbook on Technology, Getting the Most from a Cloud-Based Finance System, brought to you by CFO Publishing, an Argyle company, and our sponsor, Workday. I'm Chris Schmidt, and I'll be your moderator. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few features of the console. On the left-hand side, you'll be able to view slides and polling questions during the webcast. You'll also be able to download a PDF of today's slides by clicking on the link in the resource list icon area. We invite you to ask questions at any time during today's webcast in the Q&A area of your console. And we hope to have time to answer your questions at the end of the webcast, so please feel free to submit them. You'll also have the opportunity to earn a certificate for one continuing professional education credit. To be eligible, you must respond to all three polling questions that we have throughout the webcast. Does remain on the event for 50 minutes. After the webcast, if you're eligible to receive credit, you'll be able to click on an icon to download the certificate located in the certification section. Now we'd like to have our featured speakers introduce themselves. They are Michael Huckles, Greg Robinson, and David McKellar. Michael, can you start us off and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Certainly. Hi there, everyone. My name is Michael Huckles. I have been in the finance space now for about 25 years, and over the last 20 years or so, my focus has really been on finance transformation and helping organizations improve the finance function with a special emphasis on technology. So I'm a bit of a hybrid of both finance and technology in my focus.
Excellent. Greg, can you please tell us about yourself?
Sure. This is Greg Robinson. I'm a principal with the Hackett Group with responsibility in EPM, ERP, and analytics. I've been in the space for about 18 years with the primary focus of driving large-scale finance transformation in the areas of process, information, organization, and technology. So I would say, especially in the last 5-6 years, there's a lot of changes that are going on in technology that are impacting the finance function. So we're excited to share that with you today.
Thanks so much. And David, can you please tell us about yourself?
For sure. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is David McKellar. I'm with BDO, a global mid-market accounting firm. Spent, I guess, the last 16 to 20 years really spent in the, we'll call it integrated business systems, really focused in terms of working with clients and implementing the value that would come with these integrated business solutions.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you all, and welcome. I think we're going to jump right into our panel discussion now, and we'll get started with the first question. And this question, Greg will lead us off. Greg, what are the primary reasons companies implement cloud-based finance systems?
Obviously, a great question, and it spans a lot of different areas. But for those of you that don't know Hackett, at our core, we're a benchmark firm. We do a lot of different research. So each year we execute key issue studies. And in this year, this most recent study in 2017, 91% of the CFOs that we've studied report that digital transformation will fundamentally change the way finance services are delivered over the next 3 to 5 years. Digital transformation is bringing huge promise. Finance executives are recognizing that new technologies offer a great opportunity for performance improvements at lower price points that will allow this acceleration to benefit and faster adoption of more effective service delivery models. Within the realm of digital transformation, the adoption of cloud-based applications is leading the way. Our research is showing that there's an expectation of a 92% increase in mainstream adoption of cloud applications in the next 2 years alone. So that will equate to about 57% of CFOs expecting to have adopted cloud solutions in the next 2 years. So why are they doing it? Number one, speed to benefit. If you think of cloud solutions, they're more configurable versus starting with a blank slate. In the past, in on-premise solutions, you would almost equate to them as a private plane. If you're going to fly to Hawaii, you can take a private plane and go straight there. It'll be very expensive, and you can plan your own route. whereas cloud is more of first-class commercial, where you get everything you need, you drive the best practices, but it's much more economical and configurable. And then lastly, it really fundamentally changes the work, right? So the shift to cloud is taking the onus off the organization on keeping the lights on, the infrastructure that supports the application. And it really fundamentally shifts the work to more continuous improvement and focus on the process and so on and so forth.
Terrific. Thanks. Michael, what do you have to add on about reasons that companies implement cloud-based finance systems?
Well, to add a little bit to what Greg said, a lot of it is now organizations are looking at the competitive landscape and they're asking themselves, am I getting a significant benefit by running my back office systems? And the answer is no. Plus, the pain that Greg talked about when it comes to managing and operating those systems, it's a distraction from the core mission of organizations. So now cloud is an opportunity to move that to somebody else's data center, move it to somebody else's problem set, and also take advantage of the fact that with the ability to update those systems anytime, constantly, the companies are also getting better solutions that are kept up to date. They're getting the most current thinking and technology, new features that are out there without having to go through onerous upgrades and managing this infrastructure on their own. And it gives them a chance to shift their focus to things that are going to really make a difference to their business.
Excellent. Thanks so much. David, have they left you anything to talk about regarding reasons to implement cloud-based finance systems?
They didn't leave me too much, but I guess I'll add a couple things. So, I mean, I think more and more we can all agree we live in a world with vast change, and you know, a term that I hear often now is this term of high velocity change. And I think, you know, really what, you know, the cloud is enabling is this whole focus in terms of, you know, use what I need now, drive the value now, and really focus in terms of that versus, I think, you know, what was traditionally the paradigm of a big bang, you know, drive that implementation and then having to worry about, you know, the resources to sustain the operations moving forward. I think also that, you know, there's a bit of a financial revolution in terms of being able to shift from what was traditionally a capital expenditure, you know, over to an operating type model and an OpEx type model. And then, you know, in terms of also the latest technologies, I think it's important it's not just the latest technologies. I think the reality is, you know, in this rapid change, there's, you know, always shifts in terms of where we go. If we think of consumption economics or the credit crisis we went through in 2008, you know, all those different flavors that come, you know, cloud is able to keep up at a much more rapid pace than we traditionally would have seen otherwise with on-premise.
That makes good sense. Thanks so much. Well, 3 times today we're going to stop and poll the audience, and now is the time for our first audience polling question. Please indicate the extent to which you agree with the following statement. My organization is currently well prepared to implement a cloud-based finance system. And your choices, audience, are strongly agree, disagree, strongly disagree, or I don't know. Please take a few moments to select your answer. As a reminder, for those attendees seeking CPE credit for today's webcast, you'll need to answer all 3 polling questions. I'll leave this question up for a few more seconds to allow the remainder of attendees to answer. Once I shut this question down, we will share the results. So let me just give you a few more seconds, and then we'll share the results. It looks like we do have a sort of a flat majority that agree and a significant minority that disagree. I think the only 13% agreeing is strongly agreeing explains why we're all here today to learn a little bit more. I'm going to tap one of our panelists and spin the big wheel. We're going to go to Michael. Michael, are these results from our audience similar to what you hear from the clients that you work with?
Absolutely, and it's not just what we hear, it's also what the Hackett research has shown is we've seen a trend over the last few years as we've done surveys that organizations have gone from thinking about cloud and wondering if they should have a cloud strategy to now the majority of companies do have a cloud strategy, and those that don't are playing catch up. So I think over time it's been shifting more and more from the disagree to the agree. and just continues to grow in that direction.
That makes great sense. Thanks so much. All right, let's move on to our next panelist question. This time David's going to lead us off. David, among companies you've worked with, what issues do they raise most often as they explore moving their finance systems to the cloud?
Yeah, for sure. Great question, Chris. I think the three things that, we definitely see more often than not, I think the first thing we see often is security, and there always will be and is a great concern in terms of security. I think the second thing, and this is, I think very important, especially for those companies that span global borders, is really that concept around data residency and the ownership and where the data lives. And then I think the final thing that we run into, and not so much I think now is connectivity is much more ubiquitous, but really that the whole concept of having to be wired in and connected to the internet at all times to be able to run a cloud system.
Excellent. Michael, what issues do you see raised when companies are exploring moving finance systems to the cloud?
Well, one of the big ones is with a shift of a model from capitalized to operating expense is where organizations have their current systems at in their life cycle. So one of the big objections that we hear oftentimes is, hey, I just installed this thing that's on a 10-year depreciation schedule. I can't possibly switch out right now. So am I going to have to miss out on this next wave of opportunities here? And that's something that organizations need to look at the whole total cost of ownership of the plan or the systems and take that into consideration. But it does come up a lot with organizations. And then, of course, just the question is this all new? Is the functionality that I am used to on-premise, is that available in the cloud? Is this thing mature enough for me? And so those are the big questions that people ask a lot.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Greg, what do you have? What issues do you see raised that David and Michael haven't touched on yet?
Sure. To add on to what Michael just mentioned, when you're sitting in the CFO spot, oftentimes your focus is on how do we deliver value to the business. And at times in the on-premise world, organizations have been able to deliver almost white glove service to the business, right? So applications could be designed in any way that they choose. From a cloud perspective, since the focus is more on configuration versus a blank slate, there's some misnomers out there that finance is not able to deliver the same levels of service, which we've found to be very inaccurate. So really it's understanding, and quite frankly, this is one of Hackett's most prevalent projects these days is a cloud readiness assessment of our full technology landscape within the finance function. Which cloud applications are ready from a functionality perspective? And internally, is our organization ready to move to cloud throughout the board, right? So whether it's a planning solution, an ERP solution, close consolidation, I think a lot of it is understanding what requirements do you have internally and how effectively do the cloud solutions line up to the functionality that you're looking to execute.
That makes great sense, Greg, to essentially not look at the cloud itself, but what you're trying to accomplish through it. That makes great sense. Let's move on to our next question. This one, Michael is going to lead us off. Michael, I've done a bunch of webcasts about the cloud, and we always talk about security. What security considerations should CFOs keep in mind when preparing to transition to cloud-based finance systems?
So security is a critical component. It comes up in the news all the time today. However, when organizations really stop and look at how they're structured today, oftentimes they've already been down the path that they need for this. So if they've done any sort of outsourcing before, they've already addressed the concerns that are going to come up with cloud. And it's about protecting the data, making sure you understand what data is where and who's accessing it and who has access to it. It's nothing new and unusual. You've got the advantage, though, of working with world-class companies that have much more in the way of resources that they can dedicate to the security space versus what oftentimes an individual company can look at doing.
That makes good sense. David, what are your thoughts on security considerations?
Yeah, no, I think, nothing new. I think that was the term you just used, and I think that's very fair, Michael, right? I mean, I think whether it's, on-premise or in the cloud or across the board, the reality is many of the same, security considerations and concerns, still exist. I think what's really neat now is I think for a lot of these companies that are not, at the enterprise level, they're getting to piggyback off of, the large investments being made by the cloud providers. So, take Microsoft, for example, they spend well over $1 billion a year in terms of R&D and enabling security across, across all the different solutions that they provide.
Makes sense. Greg, what do you have to add about security based on this discussion?
Yeah, I think the two of them covered it pretty well. Again, as you're looking to explore the cloud, what I would recommend is that any vendor with whom you speak to request what others in the same industry have executed that transition to cloud. We have a lot of clients with very, with organizations that are very sensitive to security, agnostic of cloud or not, right? Whether it's financial institutions, government, you name it. So what we're seeing is a lot of financial institutions, for example, are moving to the cloud, which is showcasing a bit that some of the security concerns are being pushed aside, given the experience of the cloud vendors that are coming to the market.
Thanks so much. All right, let's move on to our next question. This one, David's going to lead us off on. David, what are the important factors CFOs ought to pay attention to when comparing the total cost of ownership of cloud-based versus on-premise finance systems? What are our cost considerations here, David?
Yeah, no, for sure, and I think that's a very great question. I mean, I think the heart of it, if anything else, is really to understand and know your costs, right? I mean, it's not the traditional apples to apples comparison that you'd expect when you kind of look at and try to compare what you would see in an on-cloud versus an on-premise solution. I think at first glance it may look more expensive until you start to really sit down and walk through and work through, right from conception to implementation, right through to operation, all the different things that would total up in terms of cost. The key part here in terms of not only just dollars, but time, effort, and the stress that comes along with it is really enabling businesses to focus on their core business, which is not implementing and running, their cloud-based financial system, right? So the big thing and the good news is in this audience is really get to know and make sure you know all your costs.
Greg, what are your thoughts on TCO and the cloud?
Sure. I would say from a consulting perspective, it's absolutely disrupted our organization a bit, right? So when you think of typical costs for your organization to move to the cloud, number one, if you're stuck to on-premise, you would have to continually go through infrastructure upgrades to stay on the latest and greatest versions of applications. That cost goes away with the shift to the cloud. In the cloud environment, the vendors actually go and they upgrade your environment in place for you. Okay, so the cost of the cost of upgrading from an infrastructure perspective goes away. Number two, the cost of implementing a solution is far lower from a cloud perspective than it is on-premise. Okay, because a lot of the applications come a bit pre-configured, the time to execute an implementation is typically shorter depending on your requirements. So from a cost perspective, it's cheaper to maintain. You avoid the cost of your infrastructure upgrades, and then your cost of executing is lower. So if you're thinking about, for example, fundamentally redesigning, let's say, a planning solution, the cost of re-implementing on-premise is typically higher, right? So the impetus to move to cloud is there from a cost perspective. At least that's what we're seeing in the market.
Thanks, Greg. Michael, what are your thoughts about TCO cloud versus on-premise?
So going back to what David said, I think one of the critical things that we're seeing is that people can underestimate the cost of what it takes for them to run on-premise applications today. There's a lot of misunderstanding of how to calculate that and how to determine that impact, especially when it comes to things that you don't always think about, such as the management time necessary in order to lead a group of people and the associated aspects of management reporting and budgeting and all of those aspects of management brain power that's going into thinking about and planning for these applications that once you move to a cloud model and it's a subscription, that's all gone away. So, just wanted to reiterate that one, that, really getting to understand and think through all your costs and really think through your organizationally, what is it we wouldn't need to have and what is it we wouldn't need to do if we went from running it ourselves to just paying for a subscription.
Michael, actually, to follow up on that question, is it your experience that the skill set of the finance team needs to change when a cloud-based implementation is being contemplated, which is to say it may not be a cost change, but is it a finance team change?
Well, it certainly can provide the opportunity to redirect resources. And if you've got people who are involved today in running the infrastructure, and I would say we see that more on the IT side than on the finance side necessarily, but the people who used to run the flashing and beeping boxes now can be put to work in thinking about how do we make this solution drive our business forward and help us provide better value to our customers, which is ultimately the goal of all these organizations.
Yep, and this is Greg. One other point on that question. So as Michael said, we're obviously seeing a fundamental shift from an IT perspective in the service delivery model, right? So as Michael said, the transition from keeping the lights on to more continuous improvement. On the finance side, we're also seeing more of an inflection on individual organizational adoption of best practices, right? So when you think of moving to a cloud solution that is a bit more configured versus blank slate, the internal challenging of, hey, are we adopting best practices? Are we truly unique, or should we consider what are other organizations doing in the space? So we're definitely seeing the fundamental shift in IT in the job focus, and then from a finance perspective, again, it's more focused on best practices and how do we deliver value to the business.
Thanks, Greg. And actually, Greg, building out on that, do you see that sort of down the road that the cost profile changes, given that the sort of the migration and upgrading processes for cloud-based versus on-premise systems are so different? Is the cost basis sort of changed out in time as well?
Absolutely. So in some of our more recent studies, so again, our 2017 key issue study, 71% of organizations have major improvement programs focused on cost and headcount reduction. Okay. However, at the same time, more than half of them are also trying to improve finance's analytical modeling and reporting capabilities. Okay, so think about it. We are trying to add more value to the business at a lower price point. Okay, so how do we do that? The cloud adoption is helping to enable that shift. So from a long-term perspective, your cost profile would go down because, again, you're not spending the money on things like, executing upgrades every couple of years. You're not spending the money to maintain your servers, things of that nature. But then you're also focused on continuous improvement. So absolutely, we're seeing the cost profile go down. And again, with our recent studies, as a backing to that, is how do we best deliver value to the business at a lower price point? And that's where cloud's coming into play.
Cool. Thanks so much, Greg. Let's move on to our next question. We'll talk about some objections, and Michael will start us off here. Michael, what objections do IT and finance teams typically bring up with regard to cloud-based finance systems? How would you advise that finance leaders address these objections?
Well, from an IT perspective, it's not necessarily the same as what finance brings up, but IT is going to be concerned about the data being in the cloud outside of the domain of that organization, outside of their borders, as well as performance. Performance comes up a lot. How do we know that this cloud vendor is going to be able to provide us with the performance that we expect? And again, a lot of that should be addressed with SLAs and in talking with other customers as well. So, those can be overcome. And then from a finance perspective, they're always asking, hey, can this thing do what we want it to do? And that goes back to some of the comments that Greg made before about with these systems being more of a configuration and less of a outright customization. It does sometimes beg the question, can we do what it is that we need to do in this system? And again, a big part of that is just make sure you test the systems and get a chance to take a look at them. Again, it's actually easier with these cloud-based systems to go ahead and look at them in the context of your specific needs and requirements than it was traditionally in the on-premise solutions.
Thanks, Michael. Greg, what objections do you hear, and how do senior executives overcome them?
Sure. So we mentioned earlier about security as one, and also from a finance perspective, making sure that we can deliver the same value to the business. But also, it is a disruption to IT. It's a disruption to the work that's being executed in today's typical IT function. So, part of the objections are really handled through education, right? So if, for example, you have a sizable IT, set of resources that are focused on maintaining your infrastructure, your upgrades, all of those things, the work changes, the job changes, the skills and talent required will be different, right? So how are we making sure that we have the right skills and talent and people in place to execute in tomorrow's world, right? So we're seeing a little bit of that because, as you can imagine, the shift to cloud would be disrupting some sandboxes, if you will. So we're seeing a little bit of that as well. But we've covered some of the other items earlier around, are we ready? Is security a concern, so on and so forth.
Thanks so much, Greg. David, what are your thoughts on objections that you see in your world and how they are overcome?
For sure, and I think Michael and Greg, covered this very well. Maybe a couple quick things that I would add. I mean, I think part of it's a mind shift, right, in terms of, traditionally, the control and the role that IT would play. I mean, it's just shifting, right? It's not less, it's not more. It's just really a shift in terms of what it is that they do in terms of this world that we, that we see moving forward. And we see that a lot anecdotally in terms of, as we've moved forward in terms of our cloud implementations. The other thing, right, is I don't think it's quite always as binary. It's not a cloud or not. If you think of, industries such as retail, right, that need to live in a highly connected world, or at least in a world where when internet connection goes down, you still need to run and operate your business. I think this whole concept of hybrid cloud and running disconnected and the things that, that we would start to see, I think more and more, those are really being, those holes and those needs are really being filled. And I think that those are key objections that, we've seen that are being overcome in terms of from the IT side.
David, that's interesting. And actually, to follow up on that, you mentioned sort of industry-specific needs. Is it safe to assume that for our audience members, this is not a one-size-fits-all world, that basically different industries have different needs that require different levels of cloud adoption?
Yeah, for sure. No, I think, we see, retail was a great example that I've used before just in terms of the world that they live in connection. We also see, industries that have a heavy field service component that might be, living in a relative, in a very high disconnected world, but at the same time, you still need to make sure that you've got that quote unquote connection back to the mothership, whether it's, financials and or operations. But yeah, I mean, I think industry by industry, there's definitely not one size that fits all. The other thing I probably would add, right, is, there really has been a shift from, a blank slate and, and now with telemetry data and just kind of where it takes it into much more of a configuration, understanding you as an organization and as an industry, do you need, quote unquote, to go and actually customize because there's this, there's this flavor that is your strategic competitive advantage, that you need to enable. And some will say some, cloud providers can better enable that, versus others, right?
Right, and to expand upon that, a little bit too, from an industry perspective, we are seeing the ability to have industry-specific, almost in a way pre-built best practices into cloud applications, becoming very relevant and important. Dave mentioned retail, for example. From a hacker perspective, we're focused on